3 seconds. That was the time Mark had to decide whether to trust a voice that did not exist. 40 people in the air, systems saying everything was normal, and something impossible happening inside the control room. What happened in the next 3 minutes no one can explain. This is the story of Mark Sullivan and of the miracle of the Virgin Mary that defied all logic. But before we continue, leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I would love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. Mark Sullivan woke up that Tuesday the way he had woken up every day for 8 years, alone. An apartment that was far too quiet. Cold coffee, because it wasn't worth making a fresh pot just for himself. 52 years old, 30 of them operating the gondola system at a resort in Colorado. The kind of job you learn in the first 6 months and then repeat for the next 30 years. The same checks, the same procedures, the same silence. Jennifer used to complain about the silence. She said it was like living with a ghost. He would come home, nod, heat food in the microwave, sit on the couch. She tried to talk about her day, about the neighbors, about anything at all. Mark would just nod. Interesting. It wasn't out of cruelty. He simply didn't have much to say, never had. Until one day she packed her bags. I can't take it anymore. It's like shouting into an empty cave. That was 8 years ago. Mark stayed in the same house, in the same routine, in the same silence. Only now, no one complained about him. The control room where he worked was at the base of the gondola, thick concrete walls painted white that had already started to yellow, large windows facing the platforms where tourists lined up every day, and monitors, dozens of them, showing every angle of the 3-kilometer route that led to the top of the mountain. Jake was the assistant who worked with him. 23 years old, way too much energy for that early in the morning. He always arrived talking about something, a game he watched, a fight with his girlfriend, a funny video he had seen. Mark listened halfway, nodded at the right moments. Jake was already used to it. That Tuesday, December 15th, Mark woke up without knowing it was the last day his life would make sense. He drank his coffee, put on the same jacket as always, got into the car at 6:40. The drive to the resort took 20 minutes, a mountain road he knew with his eyes closed. Mark didn't turn on the radio. He preferred the silence. When he turned into the resort entrance, the parking lot was still empty except for a few scattered cars belonging to employees who arrived early like he did. Mark always parked in the same spot without thinking much about it. It was just where he always parked. 3rd row, 2nd space. He turned off the car. He grabbed the backpack from the back seat and opened the door, and the cold hit his face the way it always did that time of year. -8 degrees, according to the car's thermometer. The sky was too clear, that kind of winter morning that feels like the entire world froze overnight. He was closing the door when he stepped on something that made a dry sound against the frozen asphalt. He looked down and saw a wooden rosary lying there in the middle of nowhere, with dark, worn beads and a slightly crooked crucifix at the end. Mark looked around the parking lot, searching for someone who might have dropped it, but there was no one nearby at that hour. He stood there for a moment with that strange object in his gloved hand, his first instinct telling him to leave it there or throw it away because it wasn't his problem. But he slipped it into his jacket pocket without really thinking about why. The night security guard was at the entrance of the building and waved when Mark walked past. He waved back and pushed open the heavy door that always creaked on its hinges, turned left into the dimly lit hallway where the 3rd door on the right led to the control room. When he stepped inside, the smell of old coffee hit him the way it always did. The fluorescent lights buzzed when he turned them on, that irritating sound he didn't even notice anymore after 30 years, as he tossed his backpack onto the chair and took off his heavy jacket to hang it on the crooked hook behind the door. The main panel was still dark. Mark ran his hand over the buttons without looking, waking the systems one by one in the ritual he performed on autopilot after so many years that his hands moved on their own. Hydraulic pressure rose gradually as the motors came to life with a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. The monitors flickered and began showing images from the cameras spread along the route. The communication system crackled before stabilizing. It took 15 minutes, like it always did. Mark sat down in the chair, whose every creak he already knew, and picked up the thermal cup of coffee that was already lukewarm. He looked at the monitors showing the empty platforms outside, where in an hour excited families would start to arrive, groups of friends laughing too loudly, couples holding hands wanting to ride up the mountain and see the view from the brochures. 8 o'clock the door opened, bringing in that blast of cold air, and Jake came in with that irritating energy of someone who's 23 and slept well. "Dude, what horrible cold out there." He slapped his gloved hands together. "I think I saw -10 on the thermometer." -10. That shouldn't even be legal. Mark nodded without taking his eyes off the monitors while Jake tossed his backpack into the corner and went straight to the coffee machine. "Did you see the game last night? Man, that comeback at the end. I was yelling alone at home like a lunatic. The neighbor must have thought I was dying. My girlfriend said if I scream like that again, she's going to break up with me." Jake laughed that way young people laugh at problems that aren't really problems yet. "I told her football is more important. She didn't think it was funny." Jake was already used to this kind of conversation where only he talked. He sat down at his station on the other side of the room and started turning on his own monitors while he kept talking about his girlfriend, about the cold, about his weekend plans, which Mark filtered through, listening just enough to nod at the right moments. 8:20, the radio crackled with the voice of the platform supervisor. "Control, first line is formed. About 20 people waiting. Can we start loading?" Mark picked up the radio. "Wait for confirmation. 2 minutes." He did the final check, running his eyes over the screens, checking numbers he had already checked 3 times, but checked again because that's what he'd done for 30 years. Everything within parameters, everything working exactly as it should. He picked up the radio again. "Platform, you can release the first cabin." On the external monitor, he saw 10 people approaching cabin 1, a family with a father, mother, 2 small children, and 6 more adults who looked like friends traveling together, laughter and excitement. They went in, and the doors closed with that pneumatic sound. The system automatically verified the weight, and the green light came on. The cabin began to move smoothly, the way it always moved, passed by the control room window, and Mark saw the faces inside. The smaller girl pressed her nose against the glass, pointing at something outside. He went back to the monitors, checking speed, height, cable tension. Everything normal. Always normal. "Second cabin loading," the voice came over the radio. Another 10 people, a group of young adults with gear that was too new and clothes that were too colorful. University students, probably. Cabin 2 started going up, then 3, then 4, and by 9 o'clock the system was running at full capacity in that perfect cycle that repeated itself hundreds of times a day. Jake was on the other side of the room explaining something about a video he'd seen, while Mark nodded without really listening, eyes always on the monitors, checking numbers he already knew by heart. Everything working, everything normal, everything exactly the way it should be. And then at 9:12, Mark felt heat. Not the heat from the heater humming in the corner of the room. Something different, intense, as if someone had lit an invisible fireplace right beside him. He frowned and pulled at the zipper of the jacket he was still wearing. He started to sweat. "Jake, is the heater on full?" "Huh?" Jake glanced at the thermostat on the wall. "No, it's normal. Why?" "It's hot in here." Jake looked at him with that confused expression of someone who doesn't understand what you're talking about. "Hot? Man, I'm still cold. I'm thinking about grabbing my jacket again." Mark took off his jacket and tossed it onto the chair, but the heat continued, sweat starting to run down his forehead as he went back to the monitors, trying to ignore it. All the readings were normal. The system was working perfectly. Must be a fever or exhaustion or who knows what. He tried to focus on the screens, but then he smelled it. Roses. Impossible and unmistakable. Sweet and strong, as if someone had brought an entire bouquet of fresh roses into that concrete room in the middle of winter. Mark stopped and slowly turned his head, sniffing the air that definitely smelled like roses. "Jake, do you smell that?" "What?" "That smell. Roses." Jake sniffed and shook his head. "I don't smell anything except coffee and foot sweat, probably from my boots." Mark stood up and walked across the room, following the scent. "It must be something from outside," Jake said, turning back to the monitors without paying much attention. But outside it was -8 degrees, with snow-covered mountains where there were no flowers, no gardens, nothing that could possibly cause the smell of roses. Mark tried to ignore it and went back to his chair, forced his eyes to focus on the numbers on the screens while the warmth continued and the perfume grew stronger and stronger. And then he saw it in the reflection of the glass in front of him. A figure standing behind the chair. White dress. Blue mantle over the head. He spun the chair so fast it creaked. Nothing. Just Jake on the other side of the room, back turned, typing something. He looked at the glass again, but the reflection was gone. Only himself staring back with a confused expression. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it must be exhaustion or his eyes playing tricks on him with light reflections or strange shadows. He took a deep breath and went back to the monitors. Everything normal, like it always was. But the perfume kept filling the room with that impossible scent. And the heat made sweat run down his forehead while Jake on the other side complained about the cold. And then he heard it. "Stop." A female voice, soft but absolutely clear, as if someone had whispered right into his ear. Mark froze, his hand stopping in midair above the keyboard. "Jake?" Did you say something?" "No. Why?" Mark looked around the room, searching for someone who had to be hiding there somewhere. Concrete walls, monitors, the closed door, no one but the two of them. "Are you sure you didn't say anything?" Jake turned his chair to look at him, worry on his face. "I'm sure. Mark, are you okay? You look weird." "I'm fine." But he wasn't. His heart started beating faster, and his hands grew cold despite the impossible heat around him as he turned back to the monitors, trying to force his mind to focus on the usual checks. System normal, cabins going up, everything working. Stop now. The voice again, more urgent, clearer, impossible to ignore, even while trying. Mark jumped up so fast the chair rolled backward and hit the wall, making Jake spin around in alarm. "Man, what is it?" He didn't answer. He stared around the room, searching because there had to be someone there. There had to be. "Mark, seriously, you're freaking me out. What's going on? You didn't hear anything? A voice?" Jake looked at him with the expression of someone who was starting to really worry. "Do you want me to call someone? You look like you're about to pass out." Mark shook his head and took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He was losing his mind. He had to be. Heat only he could feel. A smell only he could sense. A voice only he could hear. "I'm fine, I just got dizzy." "Do you want to sit down? Drink some water?" "No, I'm fine." He went back to his chair, his hands trembling slightly, and forced his eyes to focus on the monitors showing the system operating normally. All readings within parameters. 0 anomalies, 0 alerts. 30 years doing this. 30 years trusting systems, numbers, and technology. And now he was hearing voices that didn't exist. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It must be stress. He went back to watching the screens showing cabins going up with people inside, unaware of the chaos unfolding there in the control room. "Mark, stop now." This time the voice was loud and urgent, like a direct shout inside his head, and Mark saw her, not a reflection, not a shadow, real. She was there, 1 meter away beside the main monitor, wearing a white dress and a blue mantle that seemed to glow with its own light. A serene face, with eyes that looked as if they could see straight through him, pointing at the red button. Emergency stop. And she vanished as if she had never been there. Mark couldn't move or breathe, his heart pounding so hard it hurt his chest, while Jake on the other side kept his back turned, talking on the radio, completely unaware. He didn't see it. Nobody saw it, only Mark. He looked at the monitor showing the system operating perfectly, with 0 alerts and 0 anomalies, everything saying it was safe to continue. 40 people, 40 lives depending on him doing the right thing, and the right thing, according to years of experience, was to continue the operation because the system said everything was fine and there was no technical reason to stop. But that woman, that impossible presence, that command inside his mind. His hands began to move without thinking, without consciously deciding, toward the red button. "What are you doing?" Jake shouted. Mark hesitated with his hand, centimeters from the emergency button. If he pressed it without technical cause, investigation, possible dismissal, 30 years thrown away because of a voice, a scent, and a vision. "Mark, don't—" He pressed it. The world exploded into sound, with piercing alarms filling the room and red lights flashing across every panel while sirens wailed outside on the platforms. "Emergency stop activated, system locking, all cabins stopping." The 4 cabins stopped instantly, exactly as the system was designed to do, locking everything within seconds. They hung suspended on the cables, swaying slightly from the sudden momentum. The radio erupted with confused, frightened voices. Base, what happened? Why did we stop? There are scared people here. What's going on?" Jake stood there with his mouth open, staring at Mark as if he had completely lost his mind. You shut down the entire system for no reason. Mark, do you know what you just did?" Mark couldn't answer. He stared at his own hands, at the red button still pressed down, at the monitors showing 4 cabins frozen in the air with 40 people trapped, waiting, terrified. And he had no reason at all except a woman who appeared out of nowhere. The room phone rang loudly and insistently. Jake answered automatically, listened for 2 seconds, then extended the handset with wide eyes. "It's the manager, and he's angry." Mark took it with a trembling hand. "What is going on? Why did you shut down the system?" He tried to think of an explanation that made sense. "Verification protocol. Without a technical cause? This will be investigated. Do you understand?" "I do." 5 minutes. Restart the system or I'm coming up there." The line went dead. And that was when they heard it. A sound, low, deep, coming from far away but growing louder. A rumble like thunder, but constant and increasing. Both of them turned toward the window. For a few seconds there was nothing, except the sound growing louder and louder, until they saw from the ridge above the towers a white line beginning to move, slowly at first, then faster, much faster. "No," Jake whispered. "Avalanche." A massive wall of snow rushing down the mountain, gaining speed every second, gaining volume, swallowing everything in its path as it cut directly across the gondola route, exactly where cabin 1 would have been if it had continued climbing, where cabin 2 would have reached in less than a minute. The snow roared past with thousands of tons moving like destructive white water, the noise so loud it was deafening even through the thick glass. The gondola towers visibly shook as if they were about to be ripped from their foundations. It kept falling for 15, 20, 30 seconds until it stopped, leaving a sudden, terrifying silence. The mountain now had a new path, white, clean, deadly. Jake stood with his hands on his head and his mouth open. Oh my God, if the cabins were... It didn't end because it didn't need to. Mark looked at the monitors showing the 4 cabins still swaying slightly on their cables. All intact, all safe. If he hadn't stopped 3 minutes earlier? The phone rang. Jake answered with hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. Mark, avalanche. Where are the cabins?" All stopped, all safe. A long silence. "How did you know? The sensors didn't detect anything. Nothing in the systems indicated it. How—" Jake handed over the phone. Mark took it and looked at Jake, at the monitors, at the window showing the destruction, at the spot where a woman had been 3 minutes earlier, pointing at the red button. "Instinct," he said in a hoarse voice, almost a whisper. "Just instinct." It wasn't true, but how do you explain the inexplicable? The next 4 hours were controlled chaos, with rescue teams mobilized and a helicopter flying overhead to assess the risk of new avalanches. The cabins couldn't be moved until there was absolute assurance of safety, so 40 people remained trapped, waiting, some in panic. Finally, at 2 in the afternoon, the specialists gave the green light. Mountains stabilized, safe to move the cabins. Slowly, one by one, it took another hour to bring them all back. When the last cabin touched down and the doors opened, Mark saw people stepping out with trembling legs, some crying with relief, parents hugging their children too tightly, but alive, all alive. Manager Thomas entered the room, visibly shaken, hands trembling, eyes red. "Mark, how did you know?" He didn't answer. No sensor detected anything, no alert. Everything was stable. And then this. He pointed to the window. "So, how?" Mark looked at Jake, who looked back in a silent exchange. "Tell him he heard a voice? That he saw an impossible woman?" "I don't know. I just felt that something was wrong." "You just saved 40 lives, 40 people who would have been right there." His voice broke. Thomas left, leaving Mark and Jake alone. They stood in silence for several minutes, hearing only the hum of the equipment and the wind outside. "You really don't know how you knew?" Jake finally asked. Mark touched the pocket where the rosary was. "I heard a voice telling me to stop." "What kind?" "Female, clear, like someone whispering in my ear, but there was no one there." Jake processed it. "And you just obeyed?" "It wasn't simple. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. 30 years learning to trust systems and data and technology, and I threw it all away because of a voice that shouldn't exist." "Huh. My grandmother used to say that when you need it most, sometimes you receive help in a way that doesn't make sense, but saves your life." You think that's what this was? 40 people alive because you heard something no one else heard, because you trusted something beyond the numbers. That night, Mark drove home on autopilot along the same route, but everything looked different now. The trees, the houses, the darkening sky. He entered the apartment, closed the door, and collapsed. Not gradually, all at once. He slid down until he was sitting on the cold floor of the entryway, starting to tremble, not from cold, but from the delayed realization of everything that almost happened. 40 people, 40 lives. Families with small children who would never have grown up if he had ignored that voice, if he had trusted only the systems as he always had, if he had chosen logic over madness. Mark covered his face with his hands. And for the first time in 8 years, since the day Jennifer left and he decided it was easier to feel nothing, he cried for real. Not silent tears, but deep sobs that came from somewhere buried, that shook his entire body, that hurt in his chest. He cried for all the years spent building walls. He cried for Jennifer, who tried and whom he never let in. He cried for a lifetime of silence that almost cost 40 other lives. He cried because an impossible woman had crossed all his defenses in 3 seconds. He stayed there for an indefinite amount of time until he managed to get up, his legs numb, and staggered to the bathroom to wash his face with water so cold it hurt. He looked at the mirror, seeing the same face as always, but something was different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there that morning. He went back to the living room and sat on the couch looking around the apartment the way it always was, empty. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out the wooden rosary, looked at those dark, worn beads, the crooked crucifix he had found that morning in the parking lot by chance. Or not by chance. Was anything really by chance? "Thank you," he said out loud to the empty apartment. The word sounded strange, because when was the last time he had thanked anything? When he had acknowledged that something beyond himself had control. "I don't know if you're real. I don't know if I really saw you or if I was losing my mind. But thank you for 40 people who are alive, for making me listen when it made no sense." He closed his eyes and held the rosary tightly. And for the first time in decades, he tried to pray without knowing the right words or remembering prayers, so he just said whatever came to mind. "I spent a long time alone thinking it was safer that way, that I couldn't get hurt if I didn't let anything in. And today you showed me that there are things that go beyond what I can see and measure. I don't know what to do with this yet, but thank you." He stayed there holding that old rosary in the middle of his empty apartment. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. Mark went back to work, but he wasn't the same. He arrived at 7, as always. But when he parked, he stayed for a few minutes, looking out the window at the sky growing lighter and the mountains against the dawn without hurry, simply really looking for the first time in years. He entered the room where Jake was already there. For the first time in 2 years, Jake had arrived before him. "Hey, I thought you always got here first." "I always do." "Then, good to see you." Jake blinked, because in 2 years together, Mark had never said something like that. Thanks. Good to see you too." They started the checks, but Mark realized he was actually listening when Jake talked about the weekend and a fight with his girlfriend and a movie he had seen. He didn't talk much yet, but he nodded and asked occasional questions, present in a way he hadn't been before. 3 weeks later, he did something he hadn't done in years. He called Jennifer. She answered with a cautious voice. "Mark?" "Hi. I wanted to apologize for the 8 years we were married, for all the times I ignored you, for never really being present, for being so closed off that you felt alone even sleeping next to me." A long silence. Then, "Why are you calling now?" "Because something happened that made me realize I wasted a lot of time trusting the wrong things and closing myself off to the right ones." They talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was closure, forgiveness, an understanding that sometimes people don't work together, but that doesn't have to leave only bitterness behind. When he hung up, he felt something he didn't expect. Peace. January brought more snow, and the resort entered high season. Mark continued his routine, but small things were different. The rosary was always in his pocket. A constant reminder, and 40 people would never know how close they came. Before finishing, I want to invite you to be part of our prayer community for the Virgin Mary, a space of faith and hope where people from all over the world come together to pray and share the graces they have received. If you feel in your heart the desire to be part of this chain of prayer, click below and become a channel member today and come pray with us. And if you made it this far, write in the comments 40, the number of lives that one voice saved that morning. I want to see how many hearts this story reached. Every time I read that number, I will know that one more person believes that miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen. If this story touched you, subscribe and activate the notification bell. Share it with someone who needs hope. May the Virgin Mary continue blessing you and your family. Amen.